So this being somehow represents God. Apparently, though, he represents God in a way that human beings could see him and not die. So whatever Gideon saw here was not apparently the full face of God. Because as God said to Moses, and as Gideon was afraid of, and as Samson's parents will be afraid of later on as well in the book of Judges, no one can see God's face and live. And the fact that Gideon saw God and lived means apparently he didn't see God's real face. So this angel of the Lord being, whatever it is not the full, true face of God. This angel of the Lord is God. At the very least, he speaks with the full authority and the commission of God. It's hard to say exactly what the angel of the Lord is. Some people will tell you that it is Christ, Jesus Christ in a form of himself from before his incarnation. That's possible, but it's not really proven. Some people will tell you that and speak as though it's some settled matter. Honestly, I don't really think that it is. I don't think that we can say definitively or doctrinally that this is in fact Jesus before his birth or his incarnation. It is definitely God. It is a being that carries a full authority and message and weight of God. He speaks as God. He speaks to the authority of God. He accepts worship as God. The people who interact with him seem to view him as God. So, whatever this being is, it is a manifestation of God in some form. But I accept the possibility that it could be Jesus in a pre-incarnate form. But I also think that we need to not be too certain about that because honestly we don't really know that. The scriptures don't actually say that. So even though that is a possibility, and it's right to suggest it as such, I believe, I don't think we should necessarily automatically conclude that it is. But it is a being that represents God somehow. We've been seeing this being mentioned in the scriptures since back pretty early in Genesis. Okay? And we'll see him mentioned again. So this being is pretty active throughout the Old Testament. Whatever this angel of the Lord is, this manifestation of God, he appears pretty often throughout the Old Testament. So he was active back in those days. We've been reading about him since Genesis, and we're going to continue reading about him to come. I think we're finally going to get a description of what he looks like in Daniel. We'll get to that when we get to that a year or two from now. But as of now, we don't know what he looks like. None of the texts that have mentioned him so far have even attempted to explain what he looks like. Apparently, he looks human enough that not everybody who sees him immediately recognizes him as God. Gideon apparently did not recognize him right away, and not until he left, basically, as God. Apparently, Gideon just saw him as another guy, maybe a very impressive-looking guy, someone that seemed to have authority of some kind. Maybe, but not someone. He didn't even look apparently angelic enough for Gideon to be afraid when he first saw him. So, however he apparently appears in the form of a man somehow. Okay, so moving on. That same night, this is all part of the same day that Gideon is getting his call to be a judge. That same night, the Lord said to him, "Take the second bull from your father's herd, the one 7 years old." So I guess there's a specific bull that they have in mind here. The second one is exactly 7 years old. "Tear down your father's altar to Baal." So they had a shrine to Baal right there in their backyard. And cut down the Asherah pole beside it. Remember, those Asherah poles were trees or some kind of carved tree or decorated tree or pole that was somehow supposed to represent the goddess Asherah, who was the consort of Baal. So you had a stone altar to Baal, and then a tree of some kind, a decorated tree or some sort of pole that was decorated to look like Asherah or something. I don't really know. No one really knows. I mean, these were trees. These were wooden poles, so they're rotted away. Okay, so we're talking about events over 3,000 years ago. None of these, as far as I know, they've never found any of these poles because, again, this is wood, and over 3,300 years it would have rotted away. And I'm not even really sure if we have any depictions of them in art form to really get an idea of what they would have looked like. but they were some kind of pole or some sort of decorated or carved or stylized tree that were planted near these stone altars to Baal. Tear down your father's altar to Baal, and cut down the Asherah pole beside it. And they even had, some of these Israelites even got, see, okay, and as I mentioned this before, but I'll mention it again just so we get clear on this. The ancient minds often thought that there had to be a male and female god in order to come together to make the world or make stuff. So you had Baal, who was basically a storm. Again, there were lots of different Baals. But basically, Baal was a storm god. He was responsible for fertilizing the land. And Asherah was a fertility goddess, who was the land itself, who was fertilized by Baal. Okay? And so to worship, and then of course, so when Baal sprayed his rain in Asherah, Asherah became fertile and bore fruit. And that is what created, in their minds, that is what created the abundance of the produce in the land. It made sense to them. Like they felt that they need that, you needed that sort of male, female, or reproductive aspect in order to make sense of creation, make sense of the world they were living in. A lot of cultures have also had that idea in their minds somewhere back in their past. And so again, as I said before, when you would go to their hilltop shrine to offer your sacrifice and worship, it would often culminate with you performing an act of sex with a shrine prostitute, or male or female, who happened to be there and was there for that purpose. Someone that you could have sex with after you offered your offering to Baal and Asherah. And so that was thought then to, you're gonna fertilize the land. Well, what land is going to be fertile because you've been faithful to Baal and Asherah. In fact, the Israelites got so confused on this that we've even found evidence that they paired up Yahweh. Now, again, these Israelites knew about Yahweh. Okay, it's not like they didn't remember God at all, or they forgot about Jehovah. Okay, so it's not like that. A lot of times we get that idea, and the scriptures kind of present it that way, because to the point of view of these scribes and prophets who wrote this down, that's basically what happened for all intents and purposes. To accept the worship of other gods is breaking the first of the commandments, and so it's essentially as effective as abandoning God completely. In their minds, though, they wouldn't have seen themselves doing that. Like they didn't see themselves as forgetting about their God or breaking the covenant. They didn't see that way. If they had, they probably wouldn't have done it so freely. Okay, what they think they're doing is they think they still remember. Gideon knew about Jehovah, and these people knew about. They didn't forget about Jehovah. It's just that they also started worshiping Baal and Asherah and other gods. Okay, which again, from the point of view of God and the prophets who wrote this stuff down, it's the same thing. Accepting Baal worship or Asherah worship or Dagon from the Philistines or whatever is just the same thing as forgetting Jehovah. But these people wouldn't have seen it that way. Gideon and his father and the people in that town, they would not have seen it that way. They would have thought that they were being faithful to God because they still knew about Jehovah. They probably still had an altar to Jehovah somewhere. They probably still offered sacrifices to Jehovah. It's just that they also offered sacrifices to Baal. So as I was saying about Asherah, they were so confused that we've even found evidence that they paired Yahweh or Jehovah up with Asherah, not just with Baal. They thought that God needed a lady god in order to have sex with, in order to populate the land. And that's how confused they were. But they would not have seen it, in their minds, they would not have seen it as though they were abandoning God. They were abandoning their covenant, God of Jehovah. They were. God saw it that way. The prophets saw it that way. That's how the Old Testament is written. But they wouldn't have seen it that way. Now, they were wrong, of course. But in their view, they weren't giving up God. They weren't giving up their covenant God, Jehovah. by pairing him up with Baal and Asherah and all this stuff. They didn't think they were doing that. They were doing that, but they didn't think so. Then, okay, so tear down your father's altar to Baal and cut down the Asherah pole beside it. Then build a proper kind of altar, or build with layers of stone an altar, and to the Lord your God on the top of this height, so some sort of hilltop or something. Using the wood of the Asherah pole that you cut down, offer the second bull, as a burnt offering, the full-grown bull. So the Asherah pole, which is wood, is going to be chopped down and used as kindling for the fire that's going to be used to burn up this bull offering. That's what we think of Asherah. I don't know what happens to the Baal. I mean, they're going to tear down the Baal altar. I don't know what they're going to do with those materials. I guess just scatter them around. I don't know. I don't think they would build the Jehovah altar out of the old materials of the Baal altar. So, but I don't know what you can do with stone. Can you burn it up? I mean, bury it, I guess, but it doesn't say to do anything with that. With wood, though, you can burn. With a wooden pole, you can use that as kindling for a fire. So Gideon took 10 of his servants. Now Gideon said earlier his clan was the weakest in Manasseh. That's not true. His family, he himself has 10 servants, at least 10 servants. They say he took 10 of his servants. Doesn't even say all 10. It's like he might have more. He might have 20, as far as we know. He has at least 10 servants because he took 10 of them to do this. And that's just him. That's not his family's servants. That's not his father's servants. Those are his servants. Those are Gideon's own personal servants. He has at least 10 of them. His father has this Baal altar in his backyard. Okay, so this area, these Abiezrites, whatever they are, Gideon's family was prominent amongst these Abiezrites. So when Gideon was talking to God about being the weakest and the least, he was not being accurate. He was making an excuse. Moses made excuses to God before. People always make excuses. We shouldn't pick on Gideon for that, because people always make excuses. But we know that Gideon cannot have been speaking the truth when he was trying to de-emphasize himself, because the least of the family, or the weakest in the clan, or the weakest in the tribe, would not be someone with at least 10 of his own personal servants, and with the local altar in his backyard. So Gideon took 10 of his servants and did as the Lord told him. But because he was afraid of his family and the men of the town, he did it at night rather than in the daytime. In the morning, when the men of the town got up, there was Baal's altar demolished, and with the Asherah pole beside it cut down, and the second bull sacrificed on the newly built altar. They asked each other, "Who did this?" When they carefully investigated, they were told, "Gideon, son of Joash, did it." So Gideon wanted to not be found out, but he got found out. The men of the town demanded of Joash, "Bring out your son! He must die, because he has broken down Baal's altar and cut down the Asherah pole beside it." But Joash replied to the hostile crowd around him, "Are you going to plead Baal's cause? Are you trying to save Baal? Whoever fights for him shall be put to death by morning. If Baal really is a god, he can defend himself when someone breaks down his altar." So that day they called Gideon Jerubbaal, which means, by the way, "Let Baal contend," saying, "Let Baal contend with him," because he broke down Baal's altar. Now, Joash, this altar, this altar is in Joash's custody. He clearly is a Baal worshiper. Joash may believe in his heart that he is also worshiping Jehovah when he goes to the Jehovah altar and offers the sacrifices, assuming he does that. But he clearly also worships Baal. So when he's talking to these crowds, he's using a logic argument to get his son out of a jam. He is telling the crowd to not, that if Baal is strong enough to defend it, if Baal is a strong enough God, he does not need the crowd to defend him when someone attacks him, like Gideon has done. And so what he's saying here is that now if you then, this angry crowd, take up arms for Baal, you're admitting that Baal is not strong enough to fight for himself. He says that in which they would be admitting that. So he is presenting a logic problem to them to get his son out of a jam. Maybe in this one day he's become convinced that Baal is not God, maybe. Gideon apparently did. I don't know. I believe up until now, at least, Joash was a Baal worshiper. Maybe this was enough to convince him to give that up. Maybe. But I think what he's really doing here is he's getting his son out of a jam by presenting these men with a logic problem that they are unable to solve. So he has kind of pinned them in, following the lines of their own logic and their own way of thinking, to get them to stop going after Gideon, because if they fight on behalf of Baal, they're admitting then that Baal is not strong enough to fight for himself. But of course, Baal is not strong enough to fight for himself, since Baal does not exist. But if they did that, if they took it upon themselves to fight for Baal, on Baal's honor, and fight against Gideon and kill him, they'd be admitting that Baal is too weak to defend himself. So he gets them to stop by cornering them with that argument. I don't know if that means he's given up his own belief in Baal. Maybe it does. I think it just means he's thinking of a way to get his son out of a jam. Now all the Midianites, Amalekites, and other eastern peoples joined forces and crossed over the Jordan and camped in the valley of Jezreel. So they're gonna that means they're gonna have a fight. They're all together in one place, and we're gonna take the fight right to them. Then the Spirit of the Lord came upon Gideon, and he blew a trumpet, summoning the Abiezrites to follow him. He sent messengers throughout Manasseh, calling them to arms, and also into Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali, so they too went up to meet him. So they're not going to put up with this this roaming band of invaders coming into their land and stealing all their crops any longer. They've had 7 years of this, and they're not going to have an eighth. That's going to be enough. Gideon said to God. So despite all that, though, Gideon is not yet convinced. Gideon said to God, "If you will save Israel by my hand, as you have promised, look, I will place a wool fleece on the threshing floor. If there is dew only on the fleece and all the ground is dry, then I will know that you will save Israel by my hand, as you said." So he wants another sign. He's already gotten his sign. He wants another one, though. He is just not certain about this. And that is what happened. Gideon rose early the next day. He squeezed the fleece and wrung out the dew, a bowlful of water. However, the fleece could have absorbed the dew on its own. This may not be as much of a sign as Gideon thought it might be. So he wants another one now. Then Gideon said to God, "Do not be angry with me. Let me make just one more request. Allow me one more test with the fleece. This time, make the fleece dry and the ground covered with dew." That night, God did so. Only the fleece was dry. All the ground was covered with dew. That's more of a miracle, because that fleece would have absorbed the water around it. But if the whole ground is dry and the fleece is wet, but the fleece is dry, we know God intervened.